Coming up on 60 Minutes, the crime that shocked the world.
She's become a hero and an inspiration.
For 10 years, Gisele Pelicot was drugged and abused by her own husband. How did your father get away with it for so long?
He was a master.
And 70 of his accomplices.
I really hate him.
But is this just the beginning of the depravity?
It's just straight out of a film. Silence of the Lambs or something.
Hello again and welcome to the 60 Minutes podcast, Extra Minutes. My name is Dimity, Clancy, and joining me today is our producer and a very dear friend of mine, Natalie, Clancy.
Hello.
Natalie.
Thank you.
Today we are going to talk about the case of Dominique Pelicot, and it's a case that the whole world has been talking about, especially because the trial ended just late last year. But I have to say, I started my career off as a crime reporter, and I went on to do it for many years. And when it comes to crimes, the case of Dominique Pelicot shocks me. You think you've seen it all, and then you hear about him.
Even in this story within itself, you hear one layer of it, and you think that's shocking and that's horrific, and then there's more.
I think the thing that really gets me about this story is that we're talking about a dad. And according to the world, he was an everyday loving family man who even fooled his own unsuspecting wife, but also his 3 children who were into their 40s by the time they found out that their father was in fact a monster.
I think that's part of the real horror of the case too. Like, the physical abuse in itself is terrifying, but when you think about the fact that he'd lived a lie for so long and the people who were meant to be closest to him were betrayed so badly, like that in itself is what's scary, that somebody could do that to the people they love.
And this story also exposes the darkest corners of society. You cannot believe that one man could recruit more than 70 men online who were not only on the sex site, but willing to then go to the home and partake in these sex crimes. Now, whether or not they knew what they were doing when they were turning up, they certainly stayed and they certainly played their role in it. And to think that, in a small town like Mazan, where Dominique and Gisele Pelicot lived, that more than 70 men were living within an hour of that small village were taking part in this. And to just think that you live in such a small community and that sort of depraved behaviour was happening after dark, it's spine-chilling.
It really is. And I think it's kind of made even worse because all the people we spoke to for the story, the reporter who'd covered the case locally, Diane Jante, and the psychiatrist, Dr. Laurent, who interviewed Pelicot and the other men, they were really adamant to make the point that there was nothing particular about this town that made it a haven for rapists or anything like that. The scary bit is that this could actually happen anywhere. It just happened to be where Dominique Pelicot was. But this idea that any community, in France or any community on earth could be picked and you could have a cluster of rapists or people who are willing to do this, like, that's what's scary, because it would kind of almost be more comforting for the rest of the world to go, there's something wrong with that area. There's a cluster of rapists there because there's something wrong with it. Yeah. But there's actually not, and it could happen.
And it was only
anywhere.
Because Dominique Pelicot lived in Mazan. So we travelled to France for this story, and it's a 7-hour drive south of Paris. We come to the little town of Mazan. It's a quaint little medieval town of 6,500 people. And we were discussing why we were there. You don't know whether it's because you know what happened there and what went on for so long, but it felt eerie.
Yeah, and you kind of found yourself, I remember we went to the chemist not long after we got there, and we're in a queue at the checkout, and we're kind of going,
are you one of them?
Or do these people know some of those men who had been involved in this? Do these people know Gisele? It just makes you kind of look over your shoulder in a way that you wouldn't in another place.
Right? And you would hope you wouldn't have to. But also the people in Mazan, you could just tell it was still front of mind. They didn't want to talk about it. We had the eyes rolling and understandably, they've had the world's media descend on their little village. And they have to live with it, and as the journalist, Diane Jante told us, that these, it'll always be haunted now by the crimes of Dominique Pelicot.
What hopefully happens now as stories like Carolyn's get told is that the town is remembered more for Gisele's courage
yeah.
than it is for the horror that Dominique inflicted there. And I think the people who we did speak to, like some of the women and other locals who we ran into, they were much more keen, obviously, to talk about Gisele and what an icon she'd become than to talk about the men who'd done
Yeah, and
things.
before we get into the making of the story, I think one of the real takeaways of this is the women of the Pelicot family could have let it define them, could have let it ruin their lives, but instead they've taken their torture, their pain, and used it with power. They've started a global conversation. They've not only shown that, this thing can actually happen. Like, this can actually happen in our society today. But more importantly, they've started a worldwide conversation about sexual violence and allowed other survivors of sexual violence to feel empowered to speak up and to perhaps tell their truth. And that's a beautiful thing.
And just also to make it a topic that's not so taboo.
Yeah.
Like, I think we probably really noticed that being in France, that as soon as you mentioned the name Gisele Pelicot, everyone knew about it. Everyone was happy to talk about it. And that, I think, goes some way in preventing this type of violence when it becomes a conversation that people have openly.
And it's incredible strength. You stop and you think, while we're covering this, like, what would you do if that was your dad? If one day, Carolyn that day was getting her Japanese takeaway on a Monday night and found out that this devastating truth about her father, what would you do with that information? How would you feel about the man that you've looked up to for the first 43 years of your life? How would you react? And they've given a great lesson in how you can take something so horrible and turn it around to make it positive. And that's actually given them great purpose to keep going.
And it's probably also part of a way of being able to cope with that trauma too, being able to help other people. It helps them manage their own,
to not feel shame,
Yeah,
and
it helps them to manage, their own journey, I suppose.
Yeah, and so, and Carolyn, I really loved her. I was impressed by her, and I thought, you know what, not only is she sitting here dressed, makeup on, as I said, like, this could really ruin your life, but she's there for a purpose. She shared her family's most horrible hidden torment, and her and her mum together are making huge waves around the world to make it better.
And I think too, it was really clear to us that they're just normal people.
Yeah.
And like, this is why I think the story hits home for so many people, is because they are just a normal family, and you can so easily see how it could be anyone. And she was, even though they've been through this trauma, she still had a sense of humour. She was still a really warm person. She was, having a joke throughout the day when we weren't sort of talking about the intense stuff.
Yeah.
And to be able to keep that part of herself, I think sends a really good message too, that she's not sort of overwhelmed by the pain of what she's been through.
How did we make it?
How did we make it?
So we drove our 7 hours. We drove our 7 hours to Mazan. And already at this time of the year, obviously in France it's freezing. So it got colder and colder as we made our way down towards the small village. I think one of the challenging things for this story was the translator. So obviously a couple of the talent in the story spoke French, so we needed to have a translator. So how did you set it up, Nat?
So we probably set it up as a team, but we had Sam, who was a local guy who was helping us with the translation. So in these interviews, I suppose, we'd sit Sam directly behind you, and obviously the person you're interviewing sitting directly opposite, like me, would be speaking French, and you'd just go around in a circle of, you say something in English, Sam says something in French, and it goes through. But I guess, how did you find that as an interviewing, experience? Because it can get a bit disjointed with so many pauses and...
It was funny because I think that, especially the psychiatrist, Dr. Laurent, he had English, but I think it was a confidence thing. They wanted to have the conviction they needed for a story like this, so they wanted to do it in French. But I could tell he was understanding me. But also you could tell by the tone in their voice and the look on their face, actually the kind of thing that they were saying. So yeah, it wasn't. It was quite smooth. I thought. It turned out all right. And then we obviously get a voiceover artist to record the English once we get home, and worked out which parts we were going to use. Also, there was the driving sequence through Mazan, which turns out to be, 1 minute or 2 minutes on television, but that took a while to shoot.
It took the best
really
part
nice
of a couple of hours, do you reckon?
I think so, yeah.
This was with the journalist Diane Jonte, and I guess we wanted to film that because when we arrived, we found ourselves thinking like, oh my God, these are the same roads all these men drove down to commit these awful crimes, and it felt really eerie. So we wanted to sort of capture that for the story.
In that scenario, we've got Diane and I in the car. We had at one point the drone over the top. It's fitted out with lights, and there's a camera on the bonnet. So you're trying to not let all of those outside distractions take your attention when you're trying to focus on exactly, that little snippet of talking that we need to capture. But I think it worked. I think it worked quite well. You're in constant communication because the drone's up. You've got the cameraman in a different car or on the road. So we had our walkie-talkies out that day communicating. So, yeah, it's for what looks like 1 minute on the television, it actually can take quite a long time to capture.
And it's a good exercise in teamwork with our cameraman Jack and sound recorders Chick, and in patience too, because you have to do the same thing so many times over and over again. But I think it paid off in the end. It looked lovely.
And then there was the interview with Diane outside. So our cameramen, obviously, they love to shoot pretty pictures in places that have really good light. And one of them was a courtyard in the house that we were staying, that they wanted to film the interview out there. But what was it, -3, -2?
It was cold that morning.
It was really cold. And we all had wet noses during the interview, so we all had to keep stopping and wiping our noses as we went in between questions. So there are all the little elements that you come across when you're filming, and everyone's away from home or overseas. But I think it overall, I think the sense was that the people of Mazan really don't want this crime to define, their little pocket of countryside that they all know and love.
Totally. And what about the house itself? When we first walked up to the house where it happened, what was going through your head?
Well, again, I think it's because you know what went on there, and we filmed one of the piece to cameras we filmed at nighttime, and we got some shots so we were in that neighbourhood at night, and it was this quiet, secluded little cul-de-sac. And it was so eerie to be there, but was it because you knew what happened there?
Totally, yeah. I don't think I will ever forget, though, that feeling of walking up that little street to the cul-de-sac with Jack. And we got to outside the house and it was pitch black. Like there were no lights on the street, nothing. So we actually couldn't shoot because it was too dark. But just thinking how many times, 200 times, men walked up and down this path having committed those heinous crimes.
But it was
really unsettling.
They arrived there knowing what they were about to do, and they left there knowing what they had just done.
And going back to their normal lives as a butcher, plumber, father, grandfather, soldier,
Goes to show you never know what's going on next door, do you? So overall, the big takeaway for me from this story is what you do when something really terrible happens in your life. And I think that it's testament to Gisele and Carolyn about how they've handled not only themselves, but what they've been able to achieve so far when it comes to the crimes of Dominique Pelicot, a man that they, both loved, once looked up to, one called husband, one called dad, and I think just the depravity of one man who everyone thought was just a normal man, I think is shocking and will stay with me forever. As I said, I've covered many crime stories, and this one probably takes the cake. One of the big takeaways, I think, from this story for me was what the women of the Pelicot family have done with their trauma and their pain and their grief. And, you have to think something like this could shatter any family. And, it has taken its toll on, the relationship between Gisele and Carolyn. It is strained. And of course it would be. It's understandable. So I think the way Carolyn described it was that they're all just respecting each other on their own journey. But I think I wasn't shocked to learn that there are fractures in the family, and when you're all trying to cope with something so horrible, of course that's going to happen.
And she said too that her father had robbed her of so many things, and I think her phrasing was that she didn't want to leave him any more gifts, as in she didn't want him to think that what he had done had hurt her relationship with her mum to to too great an extent.
Yeah.
And I could understand that too, that they're working really hard to try and move through this at their own pace, knowing that, you know, that they need to be there for each other because they've been through something that not many other people have.
And I think at the end of the day too, they still put, you know, their differences aside at this point in time for the greater good. I think one thing that they do both agree on is that they're on this campaign to make it better for survivors of sexual violence, and so you've got to give it to them.
Absolutely.
You know, as I said, I wouldn't have a clue how I would be if that was me dealing with that, but it's for a story so horrible, I think there's also some great hope in this, and I think that women around the world, you know, everyone is looking up to Gisele Pelicot and thankful that her bravery has potentially saved women's lives. And that's a great thing.
Absolutely it is.
So, Natty, thank you. Thank you for coming on and chatting with me today.
Thank you for having me.
And don't forget, you can watch the full story on YouTube and also 9 Now. And that's our episode for this week. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dimity Clancy. We'll see you next week.